Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever been in a conversation, maybe online, maybe, face to face, where things just seem to go completely sideways?
Oh, yeah, like someone attacks you personally or they twist what you said?
Right. Or maybe everyone just suddenly agrees on something that feels, well, completely illogical.
It happens way more often than we'd probably like to admit, doesn't it? Especially now, with just so much information flying around, trying to figure out why arguments fall apart or, misinformation spreads. It can feel like you're lost in a maze sometimes.
Well, today, our sources offer this surprisingly fun and actually really insightful way to look at these exact communication dynamics. We're diving deep into material that looks at behavioral patterns and communication pitfalls, all modeled after, well, a rather unique farm.
That's right. We've got sources here discussing a model based on cows, goats, and sheep, analyzing how they typically interact. And alongside that, there's a list of common logical fallacies.
And we know you're already familiar with these core characters. You've got the follower sheep, the confidently wrong goat, and the critical thinking cow. You might even recognize bits of yourself or, people you know in them.
Definitely.
So our mission today, really guided by these sources, is to explore how these different types might behave and interact when logical fallacies aren't just like abstract ideas, but are actively shaping the conversation.
We'll look at what the sources say about their core traits, the fallacies they might run into, or maybe even use themselves, and, what that tells us about the everyday challenges of navigating arguments and just information generally.
Get ready for some aha moments, maybe, and perhaps a few relatable, maybe slightly cringeworthy scenarios that sound suspiciously like conversations you've definitely witnessed.
So while you probably know these characters conceptually, our source, the one on behavioral analysis, gives them very specific definitions. It's probably good to quickly recap those core traits strictly from the source before we bring the fallacies in.
Sounds good. Let's do that. So, based purely on the source, what's the defining thing about the sheep?
Okay, so the source describes the sheep as someone who fundamentally just doesn't know much. Their main thing is following the latch onto either goats or cows. And crucially, they lack critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
They tend to just accept and confirm whatever they're told.
Right.
Think of them as kind of the main audience, really, ready to believe.
Okay, the trusting follower.
Yeah.
Then there's the goat. Source paints a very particular picture here, doesn't it?
Oh, they really do. The source says the goat also doesn't know much, but, and this is key, they operate under the strong delusion that they actually know a lot, which leads them to talk, well, a lot, often saying pretty much nothing of substance.
Right, yeah, the classic loudest voice in the room kind of thing.
Exactly, and this is crucial according to the source. They absolutely hate being challenged, just hate it. So when they are challenged, they tend to jump subjects. And they specifically hate cows because cows do challenge them, right? They often expose that lack of real knowledge.
Okay.
But on the flip side, they love talking to sheep. Why? Because the sheep give them that recognition, that confirmation they desperately need to sort of feed their delusion.
Ah, okay. The validation-seeking pontificator who tries to avoid substance at all costs.
Got it. And finally, the cow.
Right, the cow. The source describes the cow as highly skeptical with really strong critical thinking abilities. They're familiar with cognitive biases, and interestingly, the source says they actively try to teach others about them.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And the cow doesn't need that external recognition like the goat does. Their standing comes more from their, size or their intellectual capability. They articulate, well, they also hate goats. Apparently, the feeling is mutual.
Huh, right.
And they're characterized by their ability to expose the goat's flawed reasoning, using what the source calls Socratic logic. Okay, so a skeptical, analytical thinker who really pushes back. We have our core players, then, as defined by the source. The agreeable following sheep, the loud, delusionally confident, challenge-averse goat, and the critical, skeptical cow who isn't afraid to ask the hard questions.
Perfect. So now let's bring in that second layer from our sources. Logical fallacies. Our other source, the one on common fallacies, lists a whole bunch, describing them as flaws in reasoning that can show up in arguments.
And these aren't just like academic terms, they're tools, right? Sometimes accidental, sometimes totally intentional. They can just completely derail clear communication.
Precisely. The source points out they can be intentional, maybe used to manipulate or win an argument unfairly, or just mislead someone.
Yeah.
Or they can be unintentional, maybe just born from hasty thinking or strong emotion, cognitive biases, or simply, not having much training in logic.
Okay, let's maybe highlight a few key ones from that list that our characters here might easily fall into or maybe even deploy themselves.
Sure. Well, there's the classic straw man. That's where you misrepresent someone else's argument to make it look weaker, easier to attack, like twisting the cow's careful, nuanced point into something ridiculously simple and just plain wrong.
Yeah, paint a caricature. And the classic ad hominem, right, attacking the person making the argument instead of the argument itself. The source even gives an example like, you're just a college dropout, your opinion doesn't count.
Yeah,
You can almost picture a flustered goat defaulting to that one.
totally. Then there's the appeal to authority. That's accepting something as true just because some authority figure said it, without asking for any actual evidence. This seems like a go-to for a goat trying to sound knowledgeable, maybe, or something a sheep might just easily accept.
Makes sense. And the false dilemma presenting only two options as if they're the only possibilities, ignoring everything in between. Like you're either totally for this new farm rule
Yeah.
or you obviously want the whole farm to fail.
Right, no middle ground. Then the slippery slope, arguing that one small step will inevitably lead to this whole cascade of terrible events. If we let the sheep question this one little thing, next they'll question everything and boom, total anarchy on the farm.
Hey, right. Dramatic. What about circular reasoning?
Ah, yeah. That's where the premise and the conclusion are basically the same thing, just maybe worded differently. You go in a circle. This rule is the best rule because it's written in the official rule book, and the official rule book only contains the best rules, like this one. See?
Yeah, you end up back where you started. Okay.
Then post hoc, short for post hoc ergo propter hoc. Big name, simple idea. Assuming that because event B happened after event A must have caused event B.
Like superstition almost.
Kind of. Ever since that new cow moved in, the grass hasn't grown as well. It must be their fault. No actual link shown, just timing.
Gotcha. Appeal to emotion seems pretty self-explanatory.
It is, using feelings, fear, pity, anger, whatever, instead of facts or logic to persuade someone. But think of the hardworking goats. Their feelings will be so hurt if you keep asking these difficult questions.
Manipulative. And the bandwagon fallacy.
That's the everyone's doing it argument. Saying something must be true or right simply because lots of people believe it. Come on, everyone knows the best time to plant turnips is during a full moon. It's just obvious.
Even if there's zero evidence. Right. And lastly, hasty generalization.
That's making a big, sweeping claim based on really limited, insufficient evidence. I met one goat who is really stubborn, therefore all goats are completely unreasonable.
Okay. One bad apple spoils the whole bunch fallacy.
Pretty much. So, okay. We've got our defined characters from one source and our defined list of reasoning flaws from the other. Now let's put them together, like our sources imply, and see how these types might actually interact when fallacies become part of the mix. This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yeah, let's start with the goat. Given those traits, the source describes that delusion of knowledge, the talkativeness, the desperate need for validation, and that absolute hatred of being challenged, especially by a cow. How do fallacies fit into their world?
Well, remember the source notes the cow uses Socratic logic to expose the goat, right?
Yeah, asking questions to show the flaws.
Exactly. Socratic logic, as the source suggests, isn't about yelling. It's about asking those probing questions that highlight inconsistencies or maybe a total lack of evidence. So when a cow does this, it directly challenges the goat's image, their perceived authority, and it exposes that true face. The source mentions the face of not really knowing much.
And since the goat hates being challenged, that's when the fallacies come out.
That's the idea. They don't have the substance to defend their point logically, so they pivot. An ad hominem is like a perfect goat defense mechanism you could imagine. Instead of answering the cow's calm, logical question like, okay, but what's the actual evidence for that claim? Oh, the goat might just snap back right. Oh, here we go again. Typical skeptical cow, always trying to make things difficult. You just don't like new ideas. See? Attacking the cow's personality, not the question.
Totally. Or imagine the cow is calmly asking about the steps in the goat's grand plan, and the questions start revealing it's full of holes. To escape that scrutiny, maybe the goat busts out a slippery slope argument.
Yeah, like, look, if we get bogged down in these tiny little details you're asking about, we'll never get anything done. And if we don't implement this plan right now, the crops are going to fail, the river will probably dry up, and honestly, the sky might just fall. Just a huge, dramatic leap to unrelated bad stuff, to avoid talking about the flawed details right here, right now.
Classic deflection.
And remember, the goat needs validation from the sheep. An appeal to emotion could work wonders there. Faced with a cow's cold, hard logic, the goat might turn to the nearby sheep and plead, don't they see how this questioning affects all of us hardworking farm animals? Don't let this cold, logical cow tell you not to feel worried about this, trying to rally that emotional support against the logic.
Wow, yeah. So the goat uses fallacies, mainly as shields against challenge, and as tools to manipulate the sheep for validation, often preferring those emotional appeals or diversions over actual substance. Makes sense given the source description.
Right.
What about the sheep then? How do fallacies impact them?
Well, the sheep, as defined by the source, right. They don't know much, they lack critical thinking, and they're basically predisposed to just accept and confirm what they're told. This makes them incredibly vulnerable to fallacies, especially if those fallacies are used by someone they're already inclined to follow, like a confident goat, or even maybe a cow using one by mistake.
Right, they don't have that built-in skepticism like the cow does to naturally question the flawed reasoning.
Precisely. A goat, or really just any loud voice, could declare something using a bandwagon fallacy. Look, everyone knows the best way to dig a hole is with your nose. All the smart animals are doing it.
Right. Okay.
A sheep, lacking that critical thinking filter and hearing everyone think so, is pretty likely to just nod along, right? Oh yes, that sounds right. If everyone thinks so, it must be true. Without even stopping to think, wait, is digging with my nose actually effective? And did everyone really think that?
Yeah, the social proof is enough.
Or the goat might drop a really vague appeal to authority. A very, very important animal from the other side of the hill. They said this is absolutely the way things must be done. The sheep, just primed to accept information and lacking that impulse to verify, simply takes it at face value. Oh, an important animal said so. Okay then. No questions asked. Who? What authority? Why should we listen? None of that.
So their default setting of just accepting and confirming makes them, like, fertile ground for all sorts of fallacies based on popularity or emotion or just unverified authority. They don't analyze the argument itself. They just accept the frame.
Exactly. Which brings us then to the cow. The source really highlights their skepticism, their critical thinking, and their use of that Socratic logic specifically to expose goats. So how do cows engage with fallacies?
They sound like the fallacy police in this model.
Huh. In a way, yeah. The cow, based on the source description, is sort of the primary antidote to fallacies here. Their skepticism means they don't just automatically accept claims. Their critical thinking lets them actually spot the flaws in reasoning, and that use of Socratic logic is their main tool to kind of dissect those faulty arguments.
So they're actively trying to identify the fallacies, maybe even in real time as the conversation happens.
That's the idea. So if a goat, for instance, uses circular reasoning, like that rule book example, the rule is good because it's in the good rules book, and when the cow asks why it's the good rules book, the goat says, well, because it contains good rules like this one.
Right, the loop.
The cow, using that Socratic approach, would patiently ask the questions to reveal the circularity. Okay, but how do we actually know the rules in the book are good in the first place? Is it just because this specific rule is in there? What other external standard tells us these are actually good rules? Asking until the goat is forced to either provide a real external reason or basically admit they're just repeating themselves.
Forcing the goat into that really uncomfortable position the source describes,
Right.
where their lack of substance gets exposed. Ouch.
Exactly. Or if a goat makes a wild, hasty generalization, that whole field of clover over there is poisonous? I saw one sheep get a bit of a tummy ache after eating a single leaf. The cow's skeptical nature would immediately kick in, right? They'd question that massive leap in logic.
How so?
They might ask something like, okay, but is one sheep getting a tummy ache after one leaf really enough evidence to condemn the entire field? What about all the other sheep who ate there and were fine? Did we check what else that particular sheep ate that day?
Right, demanding more evidence, questioning the sample size. So the cow isn't just shouting fallacy. They're trying to use questioning to show why it's flawed reasoning. That fits with the source saying they use Socratic logic and even try to teach about biases.
Yeah, and that leads us straight into the dynamics and the implications of all these interactions. The source hints at this with the idea of a negative feedback loop. What are the risks here, and are there any potential rewards?
Well, it sounds like the biggest risk is just widespread misinformation and misunderstanding, right?
Absolutely. You've got goats who are talkative and use fallacies to protect their ego or win arguments without having any real substance. They can easily spread flawed ideas.
Yeah.
And then you have the sheep who lack critical thinking and are prone to accepting whatever sounds popular or is asserted confidently. They just readily absorb this misinformation. It's like a direct pipeline for bad information to circulate and then get accepted as truth.
And that inherent conflict the source mentions between cows and goats.
Yeah,
That must make any kind of productive discussion incredibly difficult.
it really does. The goat hates being challenged. The cow's nature is to challenge flawed logic.
Yeah.
That creates constant friction. And the poor sheep, maybe caught in the middle, might just end up following whoever is loudest or more emotional or seems to have more followers, which just leads them further into bandwagon thinking.
So the sheep just stay uninformed, or worse, misinformed, constantly vulnerable in this dynamic. It paints a somewhat bleak picture of communication on this particular farm.
It certainly highlights the pitfalls, yeah. However, the source also presents the cow's role as potentially crucial. The potential reward, maybe, lies in the cow's persistent application of critical thinking and that Socratic logic.
Okay, so they're the ones pushing back against that tide of flawed reason, the resistance.
Yes, by consistently identifying straw men or exposing circular arguments or questioning those hasty generalizations, the cow provides a necessary counterpoint. And remember, the source suggests cows actually try to teach about biases. Now, while goats might resist this fiercely because it directly challenges their core delusion, right, there's a potential, maybe, that the sheep,
Yeah.
well, the sheep are followers more out of ignorance than like malice, according to the model. So perhaps over time, by observing or interacting with the cow, they might start to pick up some of those critical thinking skills themselves.
So the potential reward isn't necessarily about converting the goats, who hate being challenged anyway, but maybe, just maybe, helping the sheep develop their own ability to spot flawed arguments. It really emphasizes how vital critical thinking is in this whole ecosystem described by the source.
Exactly. The cow kind of embodies the effort required to introduce logical rigor into a system that seems naturally prone to fallacy and uncritical acceptance.
Okay, so bringing it all together then, understanding these character types, the following sheep, the delusionally confident goat, and the skeptical cow purely based on the source material, gives us a framework maybe for recognizing familiar patterns in conversations all around us.
Definitely. And recognizing logical fallacies, whether they pop up intentionally as manipulation or just unintentionally from sloppy thinking or emotion, is absolutely essential if you want to evaluate the validity of arguments. It's a core skill.
And finally, the interaction between these types, as depicted in our sources, vividly illustrates both the significant risks like misinformation spreading like wildfire and the vital role that critical thinking and just thoughtful questioning play in navigating these complex, sometimes frustrating dynamics.
So yeah, we've used our sources today to take a pretty deep dive into the fascinating world of cows, goats, and sheep, and the logical fallacies they might encounter or even employ.
It's kind of amazing how thinking about conversations through this farm analogy suddenly makes a lot of those really frustrating interactions feel, well, clearer, maybe. You start spotting the goat, maybe using an ad hominem the second their shaky argument gets questioned.
Right.
Or you see the sheep just nodding along to a blatant bandwagon fallacy because, well, everyone's saying it. It really is like putting on a new pair of glasses.
It is.
Yeah.
And recognizing these patterns, not just, seeing them in others, but perhaps catching ourselves when we're tempted to use a fallacy maybe out of haste or frustration, that's really the first step towards clearer communication and clearer thinking for everyone.
This raises a really interesting question for you to think about, building directly on what the source material tells us. If the sources say cows actively try to teach and expose flawed logic using these Socratic methods, but goats are inherently resistant to being challenged, and sheep are described simply as followers, what conditions, what kind of environment, or maybe what kind of persistent effort is truly necessary for that cow approach to actually gain traction and potentially shift that negative feedback loop the source mentioned? What stands out to you as the key factor needed for the cow's logic to actually make a difference?
That's a great question to ponder.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive today. We hope this framework helps you move through your next tricky conversation a little more wisely.